Here we are yet again with a part 15 of the eLiquid database. Now, towards the end of yesterday's video, I lied. I said that actually the little bit of code that we did last thing yesterday wouldn't have any sort of visual output on the front end of the database, and actually it does. So just to prove that, let's pick a recipe, open it, make a mix, select a volume, let's say 100, and click create, and you can in fact see that it has added some output because we told it to stick in the recipe name and the sort of formatted VG/PG mix, the nick target, and yeah, that was probably about it, I guess. But yeah, just to correct myself, there is some output. But let's move on because I've got quite a big chunk of code to get through today. So let's go into the design view of the mix form, and once again back into the on-click event handler for the create button. And yeah, so this is what we've done so far. We got down to the bottom here. So what we've done up to this point is basically create some data in variables and arrays that we can sort of go on to manipulate now to get all of the right weights and stuff that we need to make the mix. So as a summary, we've got the mix ID, not very interesting, the total volume, the actual percentage of VG required for in the recipe, and PG and the nick, and they're all stored in these variables. We also created some arrays, one array with, well, basically all of the arrays contain all of the ingredient data for this recipe. So we got one array that includes all of the ingredient IDs, and one that includes all the ingredient names, one that includes all of the percentages for those ingredients, and one that includes a calculated volume, based on our total volume here, because we know how much of the actual stuff we're going to make. And because we've got from the recipe the percentages, we've also worked out up here as we went along how much actual volume that is. So if it's 10% and our total mix is 100, then we know it's 10 mil. So they've all been stuck into arrays, and basically they match up. So let's say we have 5 ingredients. The first element of each array will be the same ingredient and will contain ID, name, percentage, volume. The second one will be the second ingredient, blah, blah, blah. So they match up. We also then made a sort of zero-based count of the ingredients because arrays are zero-based. So the first ingredient would be, let's say, index 0. The second one would be 1, the third one would be 2, and so on up to however many ingredients there were. So then today what we need to do is we've got most of the information that we need from the recipe information, but as you may remember or not, the recipe information doesn't include some data that we need about the ingredients. That is stored in the ingredients table because it doesn't change for each bottle. So basically what that means is that we need some extra information about each ingredient, which we don't have yet because it comes from the ingredients table, and that is the amount of content in each of the ingredients, the type of ingredient, i.e. if it's VG, PG, nicotine, or a flavor. That could be a PG flavor or a VG flavor. In fact, we're only really going to deal with PG because I can't be bothered including VG flavors because I'm not going to use them. And lastly, how much each of those weighs per milliliter. Because we're going to be mixing by weight, we need to know how much it's going to weigh. And then once we've got all of that information, we can then check which of our ingredients are VG, PG and nicotine and label them as such, because we're going to need to know. They could be a random order. We don't know yet which of our ingredients in our recipe are actually VG, PG, nicotine. And then whilst we're doing that, we can also check to see if it's a PG flavor, and we can add up the total volume of the flavorings. So I'm going to go ahead and get that done right away. And so yeah, type that out now. Basically it starts here with some redimensioning of some arrays that have been defined way up at the top. I've defined a whole load of extra strings, arrays, and all sorts of things. But basically, where were we? These arrays here were created with a 0 length. We now know what length they need to be because it is the number of ingredients, 0 based. And as we've got that from this ing count, we can redimension these 3 new arrays that we're going to use to be the correct length. So that's what those 3 lines do. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go through each ingredient in this mix ing id array, and basically what we're going to do is go over to the ingredients table, and for each of the ingredients look up what type it is. We'll also look up what the nicotine content is. Now obviously that's really only relevant to the nicotine base, but in any case we can just ignore that. It's going to look for each one. For ones that aren't nicotine, they're at 0 anyway, and the weight of each of those ingredients as well, and we're storing those into these 3 new arrays. And as you can see, we've got a variable that refers to the index. So then what we do is, whilst we're working on each of these, we will check if this ingredient has the type VG, then we're going to create another little variable that holds the position in the array of the ingredient that is the VG. So it'll go through and go, is this of a type VG? And if it is, we'll go, okay, well, this current one that we're on, which is number X, is the VG. And it does the same for the PG, so that we basically know which elements of the array are the actual VG, the actual PG, and of course the nicotine. Then what we do is we just add up the total volume of the flavorings, and this is VG flavor. If it's a VG flavor, then flavor VG equals flavor VG plus the actual volume of this ingredient. And if it's PG flavor, then likewise. So flavor PG will eventually end up with the total quantity in volume of all of the PG flavors, and flavor VG will be all of the VG flavors, which we can ignore because we're not going to use VG flavors. Whew. Okay, next. Basically, we're just doing a little sanity check here to see if the recipe does indeed contain some VG, i.e. it's found an ingredient that's of the type VG, and it's found an ingredient that's of the type PG, but if it hasn't found one of those, then, well, there's probably something wrong. So basically, we're going to throw up a little message box and saying, yeah, no, we're not going to continue, and bounce out. So with that being done, we now need to start creating the actual calculations where it starts figuring out everything. And I'm going to do that now. Okay, so here we go. I have created the calculations. I've stuck comments on the end of each line here to give a sort of an example of what this is working out. And so what I've done in these examples, I've assumed that we are creating 100 ml of a recipe which calls for 70% VG, 30% PG, and 0.3% nicotine. So if we look at the first line, and the only real tricky bit about figuring this out is that nicotine base, when you buy it, comes with nicotine in it, obviously, but it also comes mixed with either VG or PG. Now, I only ever use VG based nicotine, so although in some parts of this database I've allowed for PG based nicotine, and I've also allowed for VG based flavorings, but in reality I'm not really going to include that in any of the calculations at the moment, because I never use VG based flavors and I never use PG based nicotine. So let's say that our VG based nicotine is going to contain some VG, and we need to know that because we've got a percentage of VG that we need to hit, so we need to take that and include whatever VG is in our nicotine base in the amount of, or remove it from the amount of VG that we need to add to the recipe. So the way that we do that is that we basically take the percentage of nicotine that we require, we divide it by the actual amount of nicotine in our nicotine base, which is 7.2% in this example. We multiply by 100, and that tells us how much actual nicotine concentrate, i.e. nicotine base, we need for this recipe, and that works out to 4.16 mil. So that's the amount of actual nicotine base we're going to be adding to the recipe, or mix rather. But we now need to work out how much of that is nicotine and how much of that is actually VG in our case. So we can work out how much is nicotine quite easily. We basically take that amount in mil, divide it by 100 and multiply it by the percentage of nicotine in the base. And that works out to 0.3 mil. And then by a simple subtraction of 4.16 minus that 0.3 mil tells us how much actual VG is taken up by that nicotine base. And it works out to 3.86 mil. So with that in hand, we then need to readjust our base percentage. And the easiest way to describe this is that when an e-liquid is marked as 70% VG and 30% PG, for example, that is ignoring nicotine content. The nicotine content is on top of that, and I guess the reason why that's done is because then it's easier to say 0.3 nic, 0.6 nic, whatever. They're still going to remain at 70% VG and 30% PG, whereas if you included it, it would all get quite complicated. So basically what we now do is we work out what the total volume of our mix is minus this 0.3 mil of nic, and we just do that down there, and then we call that 100%. So basically all the rest of the ingredients after this are going to be calculated on that, which is going to be 99.7 mil rather than the 100 mil. Clear as mud, I'm sure. So now that we have this, and we're calling it base total volume, we can work out how much actual VG we need to add and how much PG we need to add. And that is simply basically calculating from our base total vol, i.e. 99.7 mil, we work out what our percentage of VG is from that, i.e. 77, and we subtract any VG that was already included in the nicotine base, and also how much would have come from any VG based flavours, and that works out to 66.14 mil. We don't have any VG flavours, remember. So basically we're taking our 99.7, subtracting away the 0.3, and whatever's left on a 70% split is what we need to add in VG, pure VG. The required additional PG is more or less the same. We work out from our 99.7 mil total volume, ignoring the nic, remember, and our 30% requirement for PG minus anything that any PG that's coming across in the flavourings, which remember we were adding up here, how much actual PG we need to add. And in our example we're adding 10 mil of PG flavourings, which adds up to 10%. So basically, as we required 30% of PG minus that 10% which is already coming from our PG based flavours, we need to add 20 mil of PG to the mix. And that tells us pretty much all we need to know to start making the mix. So next time around we're going to start populating that information into this form and the embedded ingredients form, but that we will do next time. Watching paint dry would be more interesting.